In 1926, the US government panicked about the wolves in the Yellowstone National Park. There were too many of them, and the officials feared they would make the local elk population, the wolves' natural prey, go extinct. To prevent that from happening, they shot and removed all the wolves from the park. By the end of that year, not a single wolf remained in Yellowstone. The government officials high-fived one another, thinking that the problem is solved. They expected the park's fauna to thrive once the top predator was removed. But what happened was quite the opposite, and it stunned everyone. Within just a few years, Yellowstone looked sick. The landscape was thinning, many species of animals, even vegetation, were gone. Beaver, songbirds, willow, aspen, all gone in a short period of time. What actually happened was this. Once wolves were gone, the elk multiplied, eating their way through the vegetation. The disappearance of some trees led to erosion of the riverbanks, which led to disappearance of beavers, which led to even more erosion. The songbirds and many other animals moved on, reducing Yellowstone's biodiversity and threatening to destroy the very beauty the park was famous for. It took 70 years for the federal government officials to realize and correct the mistake. In 1986, they brought the wolves back and saved the park from further erosion. The lesson they learned from this is one of the most important principles of reasoning. It's called the Chesterton Fence, and today I'll tell you all about it. It's a story of human hubris and the slow realization that critical thinking is much more complex than it sounds. To understand it well, we first need to go back in history. Late 19th and early 20th century was a time of great change in the Western world. Old social institutions, such as feudalism, monarchy and patriarchy, were retreating against the new type of modern thinking. Social and political revolutions were abound. Change was in the air everywhere. Gilbert Keith Chesterton was a quirky English writer and philosopher, most famous for revealing paradoxes in ordinary thinking. Observing the waves of reform in his native Great Britain, he noticed a recurring pattern. While reformers were very confident about what they wanted to change, they were strangely incurious about why those things existed in the first place. Reflecting the spirit of the changing times, old rules, institutions and traditions were treated as mere obstacles rather than responses to some historical problems. Common law about welfare, sexuality, marriage and other social phenomena was thought to be outdated. The reformers suggested it should be scrapped altogether. Chesterton criticized this thinking. He formulated a principle suggesting that when you encounter a rule or structure that seems pointless, your ignorance of its purpose is not evidence that it has no purpose. It's just evidence that you do not yet understand the system you're dealing with. He used a visual example. Imagine you're walking down the road and you see a fence. If you have no idea who put it there and why, removing it just because it's in your way is not always a good idea. What became known as the Chesterton Fence is a simple rule that you should not remove an existing structure until you understand the problem it was originally designed to solve. The biggest challenge for understanding this principle comes from, well, politics. On the face of it, Chesterton's Fence sounds explicitly conservative, and it has been understood that way. We can understand this reflex, especially given the historical and cultural context it came from. British society has a, shall we say, uneasy relationship with tradition and change. But the principle is not ideological, but strictly epistemological. It is focused not on preserving the old order, but in making sure we know what we're doing when we decide to change things. It's actually very mathematical because it teaches us to pay attention to two very important underlying concepts: interdependence and non-linearity. When we reason about any particular thing, we tend to perceive and understand that thing in isolation. In other words, we forget that nothing is isolated. Everything exists in a complex system. Changing one parameter of that system changes other things too. Kill all the wolves and songbirds will disappear. Interdependence is a rule of nature. Very often we don't recognize that effects of changes are not always linear. Altering one thing sometimes results in a much greater change of another. Move a single rock from a dam and the entire thing may collapse. Small actions sometimes cause huge changes down the road. The main value of the Chesterton Fence is that it cautions us to think in systems, not in isolated elements. In the last 100 years, many disciplines have come to appreciate the nature of complexity. From biology to economics, scientists understand now that we can't reason about parts without reasoning about the system. They know that removing any particular part without understanding its function removes important information from the system, which makes us prone to make catastrophic mistakes. But many otherwise smart and intelligent people fall for this error. This is because we often have a short attention span. We prefer instant and visible causes and effects, and not the delayed ones. We also systematically underestimate long-term consequences and indirect effects, especially those built by others. We're biased toward action, act first, apologize later, and favor narrative simplicity at the expense of systemic complexity. These mistakes plague politicians and policymakers in particular. It's easy to be confident about removing a law or a policy rule when you do it with other people's money, and you'll be out of office in a few years anyway. When you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. To be a critical thinker, it is important to understand everything as a part of the system. That goes for Chesterton's Fence as a principle too. It's not the only thing that matters, and we should prioritize it in the context of other things we care about. That is to say, while we should recognize its validity, it doesn't mean we should never again change anything without understanding it completely. Understanding is always partial. We never get to know anything 100%. If we waited for perfect knowledge before acting, we'd never achieve anything. Chesterton's Fence doesn't tell you what to believe, and it doesn't tell you what to preserve. It tells you something far more uncomfortable: that the world is held together by structures whose purpose is often invisible to people who benefit from them. The more stable a system becomes, the harder it is to see the work it's doing, and the easier it is to mistake stability for inevitability. Critical thinking, then, is not the impulse to tear things down. It's the discipline to ask what would break if you did. It's the willingness to treat rules, habits, institutions, and even personal boundaries not as arbitrary obstacles, but as hypotheses about reality. Hypotheses written in the language of history, trial, and error. So before you remove a fence, pause for a moment. Not because the fence is sacred, but because the cost of misunderstanding a system is always paid later, and usually by someone else. The lesson of Chesterton's Fence is simple, but not easy. In a complex world, understanding must come before action. This is Think Why. See you next time.